Hey guys, most people imagine medieval dirt as something occasional, a temporary inconvenience between washes. But for much of the Middle Ages, being dirty wasn't an exception. It was the quiet, constant background of daily life, something people carried with them in ways that are difficult to fully imagine today. Before we settle in, I'd love to know where you're watching from tonight and what piece of history you'd like to explore next. And if you enjoy calm, thoughtful history like this, a simple like really helps support the channel. And if you'd like more quietly fascinating stories like this, you're very welcome to subscribe. Now, let's ease into what it actually meant to live in a world where cleanliness was limited, complicated, and often misunderstood. To understand medieval dirt, it helps to step away from the modern idea that people simply didn't care about being clean. In reality, they did, but what clean meant was shaped by very different constraints. Water, for one, was not always as accessible as it seems. In many towns, especially before the widespread development of infrastructure, clean water had to be drawn manually from wells, rivers, or communal sources. This alone placed a quiet limit on how often a person could wash, especially when that same water was needed for drinking, cooking, and livestock. Even when water was available, the process of heating it, particularly in colder climates, required time, fuel, and effort. Firewood was not infinite. Every bucket of heated water represented a small decision about resources, and daily washing was rarely at the top of that list. But the deeper reality is that medieval dirt was not only about the absence of washing. It was about the environment itself. Most streets, even in relatively prosperous towns, were unpaved. In dry weather, they produced fine dust that clung to clothing and skin. In wet weather, they turned into thick, clinging mud, often mixed with animal waste, discarded food, and other refuse that had nowhere else to go. This meant that even stepping outside for a short time could undo any effort at cleanliness. Shoes, if a person had them, were quickly coated. Hemlines dragged through the street, and as people moved through markets, workshops, and homes, that dirt followed them inside. Inside living spaces, the situation did not necessarily improve. Floors were often made of packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes, bundles of plant material laid down to absorb moisture and soften the ground. These rushes were not replaced daily. Over time, they accumulated layers of debris, food scraps, spilled liquids, and whatever was tracked in from outside. The result was a kind of gradual, almost invisible buildup, not always immediately offensive, but persistent, a background texture to daily life that people became accustomed to, in the same way that modern people adapt to the constant hum of a city. Clothing added another layer to this experience. Garments were valuable, often owned in small numbers and worn repeatedly. Washing them was not simple. It required labor, scrubbing, rinsing, drying, and frequent washing could wear down fabric that was meant to last. So clothes were aired, brushed, and maintained in quieter ways. But they still absorbed sweat, smoke from indoor fires, and the general atmosphere of the environment. Over time, they carried a kind of lived-in quality that was rarely fully removed. And then there was the matter of the body itself. People did wash contrary to the common myth. Bathing traditions existed across Europe, with public bathhouses in some cities and private washing in others. But these practices were inconsistent, influenced by region, wealth, and shifting cultural attitudes. At certain points in the Middle Ages, bathing was even viewed with suspicion. Not because cleanliness was rejected, but because there were beliefs, sometimes rooted in medical theory, that opening the pores through warm water could make the body more vulnerable to illness. So instead of frequent full bathing, many people relied on partial washing. Hands, face, perhaps feet. Linen undergarments played a subtle but important role here, absorbing sweat and being washed more often than outer garments. It was a practical compromise. Not perfect, but functional within the limits of the time. What begins to emerge is a different picture, not one of neglect, but of adaptation. People lived within a system where absolute cleanliness was not easily achievable, and so they developed ways to manage it. They used herbs and scented materials to mask odors. They aired bedding. They paid attention to appearances in ways that were visible, even if deeper layers of dirt remained. And this is where a quiet contradiction begins to take shape. Because while everyday life involved a constant negotiation with dirt, social expectations still existed. Cleanliness, in certain contexts, was associated with order, respectability, even moral character. A well-presented person, someone whose face was clean, whose outer clothing appeared maintained, could signal discipline and care. But this was often a surface-level cleanliness, carefully maintained against a background that was far less controlled. In other words, medieval life was not divided into clean and dirty. It was layered. There were degrees of cleanliness, moments of effort, and areas where control simply faded. And perhaps one of the most revealing aspects of this is how people understood their own environment. To modern senses, the smells and textures of medieval life can seem overwhelming. But for those who lived within it, these conditions were familiar. Not necessarily pleasant, but normal. The human mind adapts remarkably well. What begins as discomfort can, over time, become expectation. And what becomes expectation often fades into the background. This doesn't mean people were unaware of dirt or its effects. Far from it. There were complaints, efforts at reform, attempts to manage waste and improve conditions. But change was slow and always limited by the tools and knowledge available. And so daily life continued in this careful balance. A person might wake in a room that carried the faint scent of smoke and earth. They might wash their face with cold water, dress in garments worn many times before, and step outside into streets that shifted with the weather. They would navigate that world, not as something unusual, but as something entirely ordinary. And in that ordinariness lies something important, because the experience of being dirty all the time was not a single sensation. It was not constant discomfort or constant awareness. It was a subtle, persistent condition, sometimes noticed, sometimes ignored, always present. And as we move further into this world, it becomes clear that dirt was not just a physical reality. It was connected to work, to status, to health, and even to how people understood their place in society. Because not everyone experienced this in quite the same way. And the differences, though often small, could quietly shape an entire life. Because not everyone experienced this in quite the same way. And the differences, though often small, could quietly shape an entire life. For a peasant working in the fields, dirt was not something encountered occasionally. It was part of the rhythm of the day itself. Soil clung to hands not just from walking, but from labor, planting, harvesting, tending animals. Even the act of earning a living required constant physical contact with the land, and with it came a familiarity that blurred the line between body and environment. By contrast, someone living within a town, perhaps a craftsman or merchant, experienced a different kind of dirt. Less soil, perhaps, but more of everything else. Smoke from workshops, fine dust from milling grain, the residue of tanning, dyeing, or metalwork. Each trade carried its own textures and smells, its own form of accumulation that settled into clothing, into hair, into the very grain of a workspace. And then, at the upper edges of society, there were those who had the means, at least in theory, to maintain a higher standard of personal cleanliness. But even here, the difference was not as stark as modern expectations might suggest. A noble household could afford servants, better fabrics, and more controlled living spaces. Water might be brought more easily. Garments might be changed more frequently. Yet the broader environment remained the same. The air carried smoke from hearth fires. The streets outside were unchanged. Even large residences, with their stone walls and high ceilings, were not sealed in the way modern buildings are. Drafts moved freely. Soot settled quietly over time. Cleanliness, then, was relative, not absolute. It existed as a kind of gradient, shaped by proximity to labor, access to resources, and the expectations of one's social role. This gradient becomes especially visible when we look at hands. Hands were among the few parts of the body that people actively tried to keep clean on a regular basis. Not perfectly clean, but presentable. Before eating, before handling certain objects, before entering social situations where appearance mattered. Bowls of water might be passed at a table. A servant might offer a cloth. These were small gestures, but they carried meaning. They signaled a moment of order within a world that was otherwise difficult to control. And yet, even these moments had limits. The water used for washing hands was not always pristine. It might be reused or drawn from a source that itself carried impurities. The cloths, though cleaner than nothing, were not sterile. The act of washing was symbolic as much as it was practical, a gesture toward cleanliness, rather than a complete transformation. The same pattern appears in the care of the face. A clean face mattered. It was the most visible part of the body, the part through which identity and expression were read. People took care, when they could, to wipe away obvious dirt, to maintain a certain appearance in public. But the effort was selective. It focused on what could be seen, what could be judged. What remained beneath, on the skin, in the hair, within the layers of clothing, was managed differently. Not ignored, but accepted as part of the broader condition of life. Hair, in particular, offers a quiet insight into this balance. Without modern shampoos or frequent washing, hair absorbed the environment in subtle ways. It held onto smoke, onto the faint traces of oils and sweat. Combing and covering became more important than washing alone. Head coverings, common across many regions and social classes, served both cultural and practical purposes, protecting hair, containing it, and in some cases, concealing its condition. This was not deception in a moral sense. It was simply another adaptation, a way of presenting oneself within the limits of what was possible. And as we move closer into the shared spaces of medieval life, these individual practices begin to intersect in more complex ways. Markets, for example, were not just centers of trade. They were environments where all these layers of daily life came together. People from different backgrounds, carrying different forms of dirt, moved through the same narrow streets. Animals were present. Goods were handled, exchanged, displayed. The ground underfoot shifted constantly, trampled, stirred, reshaped by movement. And above it all, the air carried a mixture of scents. Food cooking, waste decaying, wood burning, fabric being dyed. It was not a single smell, but a constantly changing one. Sometimes stronger, sometimes barely noticed, depending on the weather, the time of day, the sensitivity of the individual. And yet, within this environment, life continued with a kind of quiet normality. People negotiated space. They greeted one another. They conducted business. They made decisions, formed relationships, lived entire lives within conditions that, to them, were not extraordinary. This is perhaps one of the most important shifts to understand. Because when we imagine the past, there is a tendency to isolate discomfort, to treat it as something that stands apart from daily experience. But in reality, discomfort is often woven into the fabric of life so thoroughly that it becomes almost invisible. And in the Middle Ages, dirt was one of those invisible threads. It shaped routines in ways that were rarely questioned. It influenced how homes were arranged, how clothing was designed, how public spaces functioned. It even affected how people understood health. Because long before the development of modern germ theory, there were already ideas about what made a person well or unwell. These ideas did not always align with what we now know, but they were not random. Many believed that imbalance within the body, particularly of the humors, could be influenced by the environment. Air quality, diet, and general conditions all played a role. And so, while dirt itself was not always seen as the direct cause of illness, the broader state of one's surroundings was not ignored. This led to practices that, in some cases, moved in unexpected directions. Instead of focusing solely on removing dirt, there was an emphasis on maintaining balance, avoiding extremes, managing exposure, protecting the body from sudden changes. Washing too much, especially in warm water, was sometimes thought to weaken the body by opening it to harmful influences. So the relationship with cleanliness became even more layered. It was not simply a matter of more or less washing. It was a matter of timing, of method, of context. What seemed logical from one perspective could appear risky from another. And within this framework, daily life unfolded with a kind of quiet negotiation between effort and acceptance. A person might choose to wash their hands before a meal, but not attempt a full bath. They might change a linen undergarment while keeping the same outer clothing. They might avoid certain places or conditions not because they were visibly dirty, but because they were believed to carry unseen risks. These decisions were rarely dramatic. They were small, repeated, almost habitual. And over time, they created patterns that defined what it meant to live in that world. But there is another dimension to this, one that becomes clearer as we move from individual routines into shared domestic life. Because while a person could manage their own body to some extent, the condition of the home was shaped by everyone within it, and by everything that passed through it. Cooking, for instance, introduced its own layer of residue. Open hearths produced smoke that settled on walls, on ceilings, on whatever objects were nearby. Over time, this created a thin, dark film, barely noticeable day to day, but unmistakable in its accumulation. Food preparation brought spills, scraps, and waste. Some of this was cleared away, of course, but not always immediately and not always completely. In smaller dwellings, where space was limited, these elements lingered in subtle ways. Animals, too, often shared space with humans, especially in more modest households. Their presence added warmth and practicality, but also contributed to the general condition of the environment. And so the home, like the street, became a layered space. Not entirely unclean, not entirely managed, but something in between. A place where effort met limitation, where order existed alongside a kind of quiet disorder. And it is within this space, this shared, lived-in environment, that the experience of being dirty all the time becomes most tangible. Not as a single overwhelming condition, but as a series of small, persistent realities that touched nearly every aspect of life. From the feel of clothing at the end of a long day, to the texture of a floor underfoot, to the air itself, carrying traces of everything that had come before. And as we move further into this world, it becomes increasingly clear that these conditions did more than shape daily routines. They influenced how people thought about comfort, about dignity, and even about what it meant to feel at ease within their own surroundings. Comfort in this world was rarely about complete cleanliness. Instead, it was about familiarity, about the small adjustments that made a space feel manageable, even if it was never entirely free from the presence of dirt. A well-kept home, for example, did not necessarily mean a spotless one. It meant that things were arranged with intention, that the rushes on the floor had been refreshed recently enough, that the most visible surfaces were wiped down, that the bedding had been shaken out, perhaps aired when the weather allowed. These actions did not remove all traces of dirt, but they created a sense of order within it. And that sense of order mattered, because dignity in the medieval context was often tied to visible effort rather than perfect results. a person who appeared to care, who maintained their clothing, who washed when possible, who kept their space from falling into complete disorder, was seen differently from someone who did not. This distinction was subtle but meaningful. It shaped how people were judged, how they were treated, and how they understood themselves within their community. Yet even here there was a quiet tension, because effort did not always guarantee outcome. A person could work hard to maintain cleanliness and still carry the marks of their environment. Dust settled again. Smoke returned. Mud found its way back inside. And so dignity became something negotiated, not fixed. It was maintained through repetition, through small acts that had to be performed again and again, knowing that their effects would not last. This repetition created its own rhythm. Morning might begin with simple acts of washing, of arranging clothing, of setting the space in order. The day would gradually undo those efforts, and evening would bring a quieter attempt to restore them, at least in part. But evenings, too, had their own limitations. As daylight faded, the practical ability to maintain cleanliness diminished. Artificial light, whether from candles, oil lamps, or the glow of a hearth, was limited and uneven. It illuminated some areas while leaving others in shadow. This meant that certain forms of dirt became less visible and therefore less immediate. Attention shifted. Instead of detailed cleaning, evenings were often about containment, keeping things from becoming worse rather than making them entirely clean. Tools were put away. Food remnants were gathered. Fires were managed, and then, gradually, the household settled. It is in this quieter time that another aspect of medieval life becomes more noticeable: the way dirt interacted with rest. Sleeping conditions were shaped by everything that had come before in the day. Bedding, often made of straw, wool, or feathers, was not easily washed. It absorbed the environment over time, holding on to dust, odors, and the subtle traces of daily life. People did what they could. Bedding might be aired when possible, especially in warmer months. Sheets, if available, could be changed or washed more frequently than heavier materials. But the underlying reality remained. Sleep took place within an environment that was never entirely fresh. And yet, for those living within it, sleep still came. This is another quiet contradiction, because while we might expect such conditions to prevent rest, the human body adapts. Fatigue from daily labor, combined with the absence of modern distractions, often meant that sleep arrived more easily than we might assume. It was not always comfortable. It was not always uninterrupted, but it was sufficient, and over time it became normal. This normalization extended beyond the home into the broader patterns of social life. When people gathered, whether for work, for trade, or for communal events, they did so carrying the same background conditions. There was no expectation that others would be entirely clean in the modern sense. Instead, expectations adjusted. What mattered was not the absence of dirt, but the presence of effort. A person who had made an attempt to present themselves well, within the limits of their circumstances, could participate fully in social life. This shared understanding created a kind of collective tolerance. Not indifference, but acceptance. It allowed communities to function without the constant friction that might arise if modern standards were applied to medieval realities. And yet, within this tolerance, there were still boundaries. Certain spaces demanded higher levels of care. Religious settings, for example, often encouraged greater attention to appearance and preparation. Not because complete cleanliness was achievable, but because these spaces carried symbolic meaning. To enter them required a gesture toward order, toward respect. This might involve washing, adjusting clothing, or simply making an effort to appear more composed. Again, the emphasis was not on perfection, but on intention. And this emphasis reveals something deeper about the relationship between dirt and meaning in the medieval world. Dirt was not always seen purely as a physical substance to be removed. It could also carry symbolic weight. It could represent disorder, neglect, or a lack of control. Conversely, efforts to manage it, even imperfectly, could signal discipline, care, and belonging. This symbolic dimension did not replace the physical reality, but it existed alongside it. And it shaped how people navigated their lives. For example, consider the act of preparing for an important occasion, a gathering, a meeting, a religious observance. The process might involve washing what could be washed, selecting the best available clothing, perhaps using scented herbs or oils. These actions did not eliminate dirt entirely, but they created a moment, a temporary shift from the ordinary state of things, a kind of pause. Within that pause, a person could present themselves differently, not entirely transformed, but noticeably altered. And others would recognize that effort. This recognition reinforced social bonds. It allowed people to see one another not just as they were in the constant flow of daily life, but as they aspired to be within their cultural framework. But even these moments were temporary. Once the occasion passed, the ordinary conditions returned. The environment reasserted itself. The careful presentation faded gradually into the familiar background. And so life continued in cycles, effort and undoing, order and gradual disorder, cleanliness as a moment rather than a permanent state. These cycles were not seen as failures. They were simply part of the structure of life. And within that structure, people developed a kind of resilience, not through dramatic change, but through quiet persistence. They learned how to live with conditions that could not be fully controlled. They found ways to create comfort within limitation. They adjusted their expectations without abandoning their standards entirely. This balance, delicate and ongoing, is what made medieval life both challenging and sustainable. And as we look more closely at the systems that supported this balance, another layer begins to emerge, one that connects individual experience to larger patterns of organization and control. Because the presence of dirt was not only a personal or domestic issue, it was also a matter that towns, authorities, and communities attempted to manage, sometimes successfully, and sometimes only in theory. Regulations existed. Rules about waste disposal, about where certain activities could take place, about how streets should be maintained. These rules reflected an awareness that the environment mattered not just for comfort, but for the functioning of the community as a whole. But enforcing these rules was not simple. Resources were limited, oversight was inconsistent, and the daily pressures of life often took precedence over long-term management. So while systems were created, their effectiveness varied. Some areas might be kept relatively orderly, at least for a time. Others would fall back into the familiar patterns of accumulation. And within this uneven landscape, people continued to adapt. They learned which streets were easier to navigate, which areas to avoid in certain conditions, how to move through their environment with a kind of practical awareness. This knowledge was rarely written down. It was learned through experience, shared through observation, passed quietly from one person to another. And it shaped how life was lived moment by moment. Because in a world where dirt was constant, survival, and even comfort depended not on eliminating it, but on understanding it. On knowing where it gathered, how it moved, how it changed with the seasons. And as these patterns became more familiar, they began to influence not just daily routines, but the very layout of medieval towns themselves, quietly guiding how spaces were used, where people gathered, and how the boundaries between clean and unclean were drawn, redrawn, and lived with over time. In many towns, this boundary was not marked by a clear line, but by a gradual shift, almost imperceptible at first. A slightly wider street here, a more open square there, a drainage ditch that carried away what could not be kept. These were not modern systems of sanitation, but they were attempts, practical responses to a problem that could never be fully solved. Water once again sat at the center of these efforts. Rivers and streams were both essential and problematic. They provided drinking water, supported trade, and powered mills. But they also became convenient places to discard waste. Over time, this dual role created a tension that towns had to manage carefully. Upstream and downstream began to matter. Certain activities, washing clothes, cleaning tools, disposing of refuse, were pushed further away from where drinking water was collected. Not always successfully and not always consistently, but the awareness was there. People understood, in a practical sense, that what happened in one part of a town could affect another. This understanding shaped movement. Paths formed not just based on convenience, but on habit routes that avoided the worst conditions, that led toward cleaner water sources, that passed through areas where the ground was more stable underfoot. These paths became part of the unspoken knowledge of a place, learned slowly and followed almost without thinking. And within this shifting environment, certain trades were quietly guided to the edges. Tanners, for example, worked with substances that produced strong, persistent odors. Dyers used materials that stained not just cloth, but the spaces around them. These trades were essential, but their byproducts were difficult to contain. So they were often located near the outskirts of towns, or along particular stretches of water where their impact could be, if not eliminated, then at least separated. This separation was not perfect. Wind carried smells. Water carried residues. But it created a kind of spatial awareness, an early recognition that not all activities could exist comfortably side by side. And yet, even as towns developed these patterns, the reality of daily life continued to blur the boundaries. Animals moved freely through many streets. Horses, dogs, and livestock contributed to the constant reshaping of the ground. Waste was sometimes collected, sometimes left where it fell, depending on the circumstances of the moment. Rain changed everything. A dry street, manageable if dusty, could become heavy and difficult after even a short period of rain. Mud thickened, deepened, and lingered. It clung to wheels, to shoes, to the hems of garments. It slowed movement, altered routines, and reminded people, quite physically, of the limits of their environment. And then, as the weather shifted again, the mud would dry, crack, and return to dust, ready to be lifted into the air with each passing footstep. This cycle was constant, and it shaped not only movement but perception. Because in a world where conditions changed so visibly with the weather, cleanliness could never be entirely stable. It was always temporary, always dependent on forces beyond immediate control. This created a kind of patience. People learned not to expect permanence. They understood that effort would be undone, that conditions would shift, that what was manageable one day might not be the next. And within that understanding, they developed strategies not to eliminate dirt, but to live alongside it more effectively. Footwear, for instance, was more than protection. It was a way of negotiating the ground itself. Raised soles, thicker materials, and, in some cases, detachable overshoes helped create a small distance between the body and the environment. But even these solutions had limits. Shoes wore down. Materials absorbed moisture. And the act of walking, of moving through the same streets as everyone else, meant that no one remained untouched by the conditions for long. Doorways became thresholds in a very literal sense. They marked the transition between outside and inside, between public and private space. And because of this, they often became points of small but meaningful effort. Shoes might be wiped or removed in certain contexts. Dirt might be brushed away at least partially before entering. These actions did not create perfect separation, but they established a boundary, a recognition that the outside world brought something with it that needed to be managed. Inside, that management continued in quiet ways. Objects were arranged not just for convenience, but for preservation. Items that needed to remain relatively clean, food, tools, clothing were stored carefully, sometimes elevated, sometimes covered. This was not always successful, but it reflected an ongoing awareness of risk. Even the act of sitting or lying down carried subtle considerations. Where one sat, what one sat on, how long something had been in place. These details mattered more in a world where surfaces could not be assumed to be clean. Over time, people developed an instinct for these choices, a kind of quiet judgment that guided their interactions with their surroundings. And yet, for all this awareness, there was also a remarkable continuity of life. Children played in these environments. Adults worked, rested, socialized. Life did not pause for the presence of dirt. It moved through it, around it, adapting without constant reflection. This is perhaps one of the more difficult aspects to fully grasp from a modern perspective, because we tend to separate comfort from discomfort, to imagine that one excludes the other. But in the medieval world, they coexisted. Moments of warmth, of companionship, of satisfaction could exist alongside conditions that, by modern standards, would seem deeply uncomfortable. A shared meal, even in a modest setting, could feel complete. A well-maintained garment, even if not perfectly clean, could provide a sense of pride. A home, even with its limitations, could offer a genuine sense of belonging. These experiences did not erase the presence of dirt, but they placed it within a broader context. And within that context, dirt became not just an environmental condition, but a part of the social fabric. It influenced how people interacted, how they judged one another, how they navigated shared spaces. It shaped expectations in ways that were rarely spoken, but widely understood. And as towns grew larger, more crowded, and more complex, these unspoken understandings began to face new pressures. More people meant more movement, more activity, more accumulation. The systems that had worked, however imperfectly, in smaller communities were stretched, sometimes beyond their limits. Narrow streets became more congested. Waste built up more quickly. Water sources were used more heavily, and the balance between use and contamination became harder to maintain. Authorities responded as they could. Rules were issued, repeated, sometimes ignored. Fines were imposed for certain behaviors. Efforts were made to clear streets, to manage waste, to maintain a basic level of order. But enforcement depended on cooperation, and cooperation was not always consistent. Daily life had its own priorities: work, survival, family. Long-term cleanliness, while understood to be important, often competed with more immediate concerns. And so the environment evolved in a kind of uneven rhythm. Moments of improvement, followed by gradual decline. Efforts to organize, followed by the quiet return of familiar conditions. Within this rhythm, people continued to adapt. They adjusted their expectations, refined their habits, shared knowledge about how to navigate the changing landscape. They learned, for example, which parts of a street were more passable after rain, which water sources were more reliable, which times of day offered slightly better conditions for certain tasks. This knowledge was practical, immediate, and deeply rooted in experience. It was not about transforming the environment entirely, but about moving through it with a kind of informed awareness. And as this awareness deepened, it began to shape not just how people lived, but how they thought about the relationship between their bodies and the world around them. Because in a place where dirt was constant, the boundary between the self and the environment was never entirely fixed, and that shifting boundary would begin to influence how people understood health, vulnerability, and the quiet risks that accompanied everyday life. To a medieval mind, the body was not sealed off from the world in the way we tend to imagine it today. It was porous, open, in a sense, to the air, to the elements, to the subtle influences of the surrounding environment. This belief was not abstract. It shaped real decisions about how to live, how to wash, how to move through spaces that were never entirely clean. Air, in particular, was thought to carry significance, not simply as something to breathe, but as something that could affect the body's internal balance. Stagnant air, foul-smelling air, air that lingered too long in enclosed spaces. These were all seen as potentially harmful. And so, while dirt on the skin might be tolerated to a degree, the quality of the air itself became a quieter concern. This is why ventilation, even in modest homes, mattered more than we might expect. Doors were opened when possible. Windows, where they existed, were used not just for light, but for the movement of air. Even in colder weather, there was often a balancing act between warmth and circulation. Too much exposure to cold carried its own risks, but air that felt heavy or stale was not entirely trusted either. And this leads to a subtle but important shift in perspective. Because if the body was vulnerable to what surrounded it, then managing the environment, even imperfectly, became a form of self-care. Not in the modern sense of deliberate health routines, but in the quieter, more instinctive sense of avoiding what seemed harmful and seeking what felt more balanced. This is where dirt, air, and water begin to merge into a single idea. Not separate problems, but interconnected elements of daily life that had to be navigated carefully. Water that appeared clear might still carry unseen concerns. Air that seemed fresh could shift with the weather or the movement of people. Surfaces that looked manageable might conceal what could not be easily removed. And yet, despite these uncertainties, life required contact. Hands touched objects. Food was prepared and eaten. Tools were shared. Spaces were occupied together. There was no practical way to isolate oneself from the environment completely. So instead, people learned to read it. They paid attention to signs, smells, textures, changes in color, subtle differences that indicated when something might be less safe, or at least less desirable. These observations were not always accurate by modern scientific standards, but they were grounded in experience. And over time, they formed a kind of practical knowledge. A person might avoid certain areas at particular times, not because of a written rule, but because of familiarity. They might choose where to draw water based on past experience. They might adjust their behavior in response to changes in weather, in crowding, in the general condition of a place. This constant adjustment created a sense of awareness that was both physical and intuitive. It was not about eliminating risk, but about managing it. And this management extended into the ways people understood illness. When someone became unwell, the explanation was rarely reduced to a single cause. Instead, it was seen as the result of imbalance within the body and between the body and its surroundings. Diet, environment, emotional state, and daily habits all played a role in this understanding. Dirt, in this context, was part of a larger picture. It contributed to conditions that might lead to illness, but it was not always singled out as the direct cause. This broader perspective influenced how people responded. Rather than focusing solely on cleaning or removing dirt, they might seek to restore balance through changes in diet, through rest, through controlled exposure to certain environments. Bathing, when it occurred, was often part of a wider approach, carefully timed, sometimes even supervised, to ensure it aligned with prevailing medical ideas. And once again, this reveals a quiet contradiction. Because while modern viewers might expect that more washing would always be seen as better, medieval practices suggest a more cautious approach. Too much intervention, especially if done at the wrong time or in the wrong way, was believed to carry its own risks. So cleanliness became something measured rather than maximized. A person did not aim to be as clean as possible at all times, but to be clean enough, balanced within the context of their environment and their understanding of health. This idea of enough is important. It reflects a world where absolute control was not possible, and where effort had to be directed carefully. Resources, time, fuel, water were finite. Decisions had consequences. And so people developed a sense of proportion. What needed attention immediately? What could wait? What could be tolerated? These questions were not always conscious, but they shaped behavior in subtle ways. And as we move deeper into the lived experience of this world, another layer begins to emerge, one that connects these individual decisions to broader patterns of inequality. Because while everyone lived within the same general conditions, not everyone had the same ability to respond to them. Access to cleaner water, for instance, was not evenly distributed. Some households were closer to reliable sources. Others had to travel further or rely on water that was less desirable. Time itself was a resource. A person engaged in constant labor had less opportunity to focus on maintaining their environment. Their priority was survival, completing the tasks that ensured food, shelter, and stability. Cleanliness, while still valued, had to fit around these demands. By contrast, those with more resources could devote additional attention to managing their surroundings. They could assign tasks to others. They could acquire materials that made certain forms of maintenance easier. They could, to some extent, buffer themselves from the full impact of the environment. But even this buffering was incomplete, because the shared nature of medieval life meant that no one was entirely isolated. Streets were shared. Markets were shared. Air moved freely. Water systems, limited as they were, connected different parts of a community. So while inequality shaped the degree of exposure, it did not eliminate it. This created a kind of layered experience where differences existed, but within a common framework. And within that framework, certain moments brought these layers into closer contact. Public gatherings, for example, brought together individuals from different backgrounds, each carrying their own version of daily life. The environment in these moments became denser, more complex, an intersection of multiple routines, multiple conditions. Festivals, markets, religious observances, these were not just social events. They were moments when the boundaries between different experiences of cleanliness became less distinct. And in these moments, the shared reality of the environment became more visible, not as something to be judged harshly, but as something to be navigated together. This shared navigation required a kind of quiet cooperation. People adjusted their behavior in response to others. They made space, avoided certain actions, followed unspoken norms that helped maintain a basic level of order within crowded conditions. These norms were not always formalized, but they were understood. They reflected a collective effort to manage an environment that could not be controlled by any one individual. And as these collective behaviors developed, they began to shape not just daily interactions, but the broader culture of a place. Ideas about propriety, about respect, about what was acceptable or unacceptable, all of these were influenced in part by the conditions in which people lived. Cleanliness, in this sense, became both a practical concern and a social signal. Communicated effort, awareness, belonging. It marked the difference between someone who was attentive to shared expectations and someone who was not. But it never fully separated one person from another, because at the end of the day, everyone returned to the same underlying reality, a world where dirt was not an occasional inconvenience, but a constant presence. And as communities continued to grow and evolve, the challenge of managing that presence would become more complex, more urgent, slowly pushing medieval societies toward new ideas, new systems, and new attempts to reshape the relationship between people and the environments they inhabited. In the absence of modern explanations, people still searched for patterns. They noticed, for instance, that certain places seemed to bring illness more often than others, that stagnant air, enclosed spaces, or areas where waste accumulated felt somehow heavier, more dangerous, even if the reasons were not fully understood. This gave rise to a way of thinking that focused less on invisible organisms and more on atmosphere. Air itself was believed to carry qualities, some beneficial, some harmful. A pleasant breeze might be considered healthy, while a foul-smelling pocket of air could be seen as a source of illness. This was not an irrational conclusion. It was an observation, shaped by experience, interpreted through the knowledge available at the time. And within this framework, dirt took on a more complex role. It was not always the dirt itself that was feared, but what it represented, the possibility of imbalance, of decay, of something turning from manageable to harmful. A pile of refuse left too long, a room not aired out, a source of water that had changed in taste or smell. These were signals, small but meaningful, so people responded as they could. Windows, where they existed, were opened when conditions allowed. Fresh air was sought, particularly in times of sickness. Strong smells were sometimes countered with other scents, herbs, resins, or flowers, carried on the body or placed within living spaces. These practices did not eliminate risk, but they were attempts to influence the environment, to tilt it slightly in a more favorable direction. And this is where another subtle contradiction appears. Because while dirt was a constant presence, it was not always treated with urgency. Only when it crossed a certain threshold, when it became excessive, noticeable, or associated with illness, did it prompt more immediate action. Until then, it remained part of the background. This threshold varied from person to person, from place to place. What one household considered acceptable, another might find troubling. But within each setting, there was a shared sense of when something had shifted from ordinary to problematic. And that sense guided behavior. It determined when a space needed to be cleaned more thoroughly, when clothing should be washed, when a source of water should be avoided. These decisions were not always precise, but they were not arbitrary either. They were based on accumulated experience, on observation, on the quiet transmission of knowledge across generations. And as this knowledge grew, it began to intersect with another aspect of medieval life: seasonality. Because dirt, like so many other elements of daily existence, changed with the seasons. In winter, cold temperatures slowed decay. Odors were less pronounced, but washing became more difficult, sometimes nearly impossible, as water froze and the effort required to heat it increased. Clothing was layered more heavily, worn longer between cleanings. Homes were kept more tightly closed, trapping smoke and the subtle residues of daily life within a confined space. The result was a different kind of accumulation, less visible perhaps, but no less present. Spring, by contrast, brought movement. As temperatures rose, spaces were opened again. Bedding was aired. Clothing was washed when possible. There was a sense of renewal, not a complete cleansing, but a noticeable shift. And yet, with that renewal came new challenges. Warmer weather accelerated decay. Odors returned more quickly. Water sources changed with increased use. The balance that had been maintained through winter had to be adjusted once again. Summer intensified everything. Heat amplified smells, encouraged the growth of what could not be seen but could certainly be felt. Flies and other insects became more active, drawn to the same conditions that humans were trying to manage. Daily life continued, but with a heightened awareness of the environment. Shade was sought. Airflow became more important. Efforts to manage waste, to keep spaces as tolerable as possible, took on a greater urgency. And then, as autumn approached, another shift. Harvest brought abundance, but also increased activity. More movement, more labor, more interaction with the land. Dirt, in its most literal sense, returned to the forefront of daily life. And so the cycle continued. Each season reshaped the experience of dirt, not eliminating it, but changing its form, its intensity, its impact on daily routines. Within this cycle, people developed expectations. They knew that certain times of year would be more difficult, that others would offer brief opportunities for improvement. They planned accordingly as much as they could. and this planning extended into matters of health. Periods of illness were not random in their timing. They often followed patterns that, while not fully understood, were recognized. Certain seasons brought higher risk. Certain conditions seemed to precede sickness. And so, even without modern knowledge, people adjusted their behavior. They avoided certain exposures when possible. They increased efforts at cleanliness when illness was near. They sought remedies that, in their view, restored balance to the body and its relationship with the environment. These remedies varied widely. Some were practical rest, changes in diet, the use of clean linens. Others were rooted in the medical theories of the time, balancing humors, regulating temperature, managing the body's internal state. And within all of this, dirt remained both a factor and a constant. Not always the direct cause of illness, but rarely entirely separate from it either. This ambiguity shaped how people responded to risk. They did not seek complete control because complete control was not possible. Instead, they aimed for moderation, for a state in which the body and the environment were in a workable relationship. This approach, though imperfect, allowed life to continue. It provided a framework within which people could make decisions, take action, and find a sense of stability, even when conditions were far from ideal. And as communities grew and became more interconnected, these individual approaches began to interact in new ways. Travel, for instance, introduced movement between different environments, different standards, different conditions, different expectations. A person arriving from one town might encounter another where the balance between clean and unclean was managed differently. These differences were not always dramatic, but they were noticeable. They could be seen in the condition of streets, in the arrangement of homes, in the practices of daily life. And they could be felt in more subtle ways, in the air, in the water, in the general sense of a place. This movement of people also meant the movement of ideas. Practices spread. Observations were shared. What worked in one place might be adapted in another, though always within the limits of local conditions. And over time, these small exchanges contributed to gradual shifts. Not sudden transformations, but slow changes in how dirt was understood, how it was managed, how it was integrated into the broader patterns of life. These shifts did not remove the constant presence of dirt, but they altered its meaning, its significance, and the ways in which people lived alongside it. And as these changes began to take hold, they set the stage for something that would become increasingly important in the later medieval world, a growing awareness that the environment, though never fully controllable, could perhaps be shaped more deliberately than before. This awareness did not arrive suddenly, and it did not appear in the same way everywhere. It emerged slowly, almost quietly, through repeated frustrations, through the recognition that certain problems returned again and again, and that leaving them entirely to chance carried consequences that could no longer be ignored. In some towns, this took the form of more organized efforts to manage waste. Instead of relying solely on individuals to deal with their own refuse, there were attempts, sometimes informal, sometimes enforced, to designate specific places for disposal. Pits were dug. Areas were set aside. In a few cases, arrangements were made for the removal of waste beyond the immediate living space. These measures were rarely consistent. They depended on local leadership, on available labor, on the willingness of the community to cooperate. But they represent something important, a shift from purely individual adaptation toward collective management. The same can be seen in the maintenance of streets. Where once the condition of a street might have been accepted as it was, there began to be moments, often tied to particular events or pressures, when more deliberate action was taken. Mud was cleared, at least temporarily. Debris was removed. In some places, materials were laid down to improve footing, creating a more stable surface, even if only in certain areas. These changes were not permanent. Weather, use, and time quickly wore them down. but they demonstrated an evolving idea that the environment could be shaped, even if only for a while. And with that idea came new expectations. If a street could be cleared once, why not again? If waste could be moved to a designated area, why should it return to where it had been before? These questions did not always lead to immediate answers, but they lingered, influencing how people thought about their surroundings. At the same time, there was a gradual refinement in how spaces were used. Activities that produced the most difficult forms of dirt, whether in terms of smell, residue, or disruption, were increasingly recognized as needing separation. Not complete isolation, which was rarely possible, but a degree of distance. This might mean placing certain workshops further from central living areas, or encouraging particular tasks to be carried out at specific times, when their impact would be less disruptive. Again, these measures were uneven. Some towns adopted them more fully than others. Some periods saw more attention to these issues, while others slipped back into familiar patterns. But the direction of change is clear. There was a growing sense that dirt, while unavoidable, did not have to be entirely unmanaged. And yet, even as these efforts expanded, they remained bound by the same limitations that had always shaped medieval life. Resources were finite. Labor was not easily spared. Knowledge, while growing, was still incomplete. So every attempt to improve conditions had to be balanced against these constraints. This balance often resulted in partial solutions. A street might be improved in one section but not another. Waste might be collected regularly for a time, only for the system to falter later. Water sources might be protected in principle, but compromised in practice. These inconsistencies could be frustrating. They could undermine trust in the systems that were being developed. And yet, they also provided something else, a kind of ongoing experiment. Each attempt, successful or not, added to a growing body of experience. People learned what worked, what failed, what required too much effort for too little return. This learning was not always formalized, but it accumulated nonetheless. And over time, it began to influence not just actions but attitudes. The idea that the environment could be improved, even if only slightly, became more widely accepted. The expectation that certain standards could be maintained, at least in key areas, began to take hold. And with expectation comes pressure. Not necessarily in a dramatic or confrontational sense, but in the quieter form of social awareness. If a neighbor maintained their space with care, it created a subtle contrast. If a street was cleared for a time, its later decline became more noticeable. These comparisons shaped behavior. They encouraged some to make greater efforts to align themselves with emerging norms. They highlighted differences not always in ways that were openly discussed, but in ways that influenced perception. And in this way, cleanliness, still relative, still limited, began to take on a more defined role within social identity. It was no longer only a matter of personal habit or necessity. It became part of how a place presented itself, how a community understood its own order. This is especially visible in areas of trade. Towns that depended on commerce had practical reasons to maintain certain standards. Markets, where goods were exchanged and visitors arrived from elsewhere, benefited from conditions that were at least manageable. Efforts were made, sometimes more consistently here than in other parts of town, to keep these spaces functional. Debris was cleared, surfaces were maintained as best as possible, and there was a general awareness that the condition of the market reflected on the town itself. This did not mean that markets were clean by modern standards. Far from it, but it does suggest that different spaces carried different expectations. And these expectations, once established, could spread. Practices used in one context might be adapted in another. Ideas about what was possible, about what could be maintained, began to circulate. This circulation of ideas was not limited to individual towns. As travel increased through trade, pilgrimage, and other forms of movement, people encountered different approaches to managing the environment. They observed variations in street maintenance, in waste disposal, in the organization of space. Some of these observations were adopted, modified to fit local conditions. Others were noted but not implemented, perhaps due to lack of resources or differing priorities. But the exchange itself mattered. It contributed to a slow, uneven process of change, one that did not eliminate the constant presence of dirt, but gradually reshaped how it was understood and managed. And as these changes unfolded, they began to intersect with another development, one that would further complicate the relationship between people and their environment. Because alongside these practical efforts, there was also a growing attention to record-keeping, to written rules, to the idea that certain standards could be defined and preserved over time. These records, when they existed, did not always reflect reality perfectly. They described what should happen, rather than what always did. But they represent a shift toward formalization, an attempt to move from habit to policy, from individual practice to collective expectation. And within that shift, the management of dirt began to take on a new dimension, not just as a daily challenge, but as something that could be governed, at least in principle. This governance was not absolute, could not be, but it introduced a new layer of structure, one that would continue to evolve slowly as medieval societies faced the ongoing challenge of living in environments that were never entirely clean, yet increasingly seen as something that could, perhaps, be shaped with greater intention over time. And once the idea of intention begins to take hold, even in small ways, it changes how people relate to what once felt unavoidable. Dirt, which had long been accepted as a constant condition, starts to become something more noticeable when it is temporarily reduced. A cleared street, even for a short period, makes its return to disorder feel more immediate. A space that has been aired, washed, or reorganized creates a brief contrast, one that lingers in memory even after the old conditions quietly return. This contrast is subtle but powerful. It introduces the possibility of comparison, and with comparison comes a quiet form of expectation. Not a demand for perfection, but a growing awareness that things might be different, at least for a time. And this awareness begins to shift behavior in ways that are not always obvious. People start to anticipate certain conditions. They expect that a market space might be kept relatively clear before a busy day, that a street near a central building might receive attention more regularly than others, that certain forms of waste should be moved, if not immediately, then within a reasonable period. These expectations do not eliminate the old realities, but they layer something new on top of them, a sense that disorder is no longer entirely neutral, but something that can be measured against moments of order. And within this shifting perspective, responsibility begins to change as well. Where once the burden of managing dirt fell almost entirely on individuals and households, there is now a gradual movement toward shared responsibility, not evenly distributed and not always enforced, but increasingly present. Certain roles begin to emerge, individuals tasked, formally or informally, with maintaining particular areas, not in a continuous or systematic way, but in response to need. Clearing debris after a period of heavy use, managing specific spaces where accumulation becomes especially noticeable. These roles are often limited and sometimes temporary, but they represent an important development, the idea that maintaining the environment is not solely a private matter, but something that can be organized at a broader level. At the same time, enforcement begins to take on a slightly more defined shape. Rules that had once existed more as suggestions or traditions are, in some places, written down and attached to consequences. Not always severe, and not always consistently applied, but present. A fine for disposing of waste in the wrong place. A warning for neglecting a shared responsibility. These measures are not universal, and they are not always effective, but they signal a shift. They suggest that the condition of the environment is becoming something that can be regulated, even if only imperfectly. And yet, even as these structures develop, they coexist with the same limitations that have always been there. A rule cannot create resources where none exist. It cannot eliminate the need for labor or reduce the effort required to maintain a space. It can encourage behavior, but it cannot guarantee it. So the results remain uneven. Some areas improve, at least temporarily. Others remain largely unchanged. The difference between them becomes more visible, more noticeable, as expectations evolve. And this visibility has its own effect. It draws attention to inequality in new ways, not just in terms of wealth or status, but in terms of environment. The condition of a street, a neighborhood, a market space, these begin to reflect not only the resources available, but the level of organization, the presence of shared effort, the degree to which new expectations have taken hold. This does not create a clear division between clean and dirty spaces, but it introduces variation, contrast, a sense that some places are more managed than others. And people respond to this variation. They choose where to spend time, where to conduct business, where to live if they have the means to do so. These choices are not always conscious, and they are not always available to everyone. But over time, they influence patterns of movement and settlement. And as these patterns shift, they begin to reinforce the changes that are already underway. Areas that are maintained more consistently attract more activity, which in turn justifies further attention. Areas that are neglected may fall further behind, their conditions becoming more difficult to change. This process is gradual and often subtle, but it shapes the evolution of towns in ways that are closely tied to the management of dirt and the expectations surrounding it. At the same time, there is another development unfolding, one that operates on a slightly different level. As written records become more common, the idea of continuity begins to extend beyond individual memory. Practices that were once passed along through observation and habit can now, in some cases, be preserved in written form. This does not mean they are always followed, but it means they can be referred to, repeated, reinforced across time in a more stable way. And this stability allows for a different kind of thinking. Instead of reacting to conditions as they arise, there is the possibility, however limited, of planning, of anticipating problems, of establishing routines that aim to prevent them, rather than simply responding after the fact. This is not planning in the modern sense. It is constrained, shaped by uncertainty and limited knowledge, but it represents a step toward a more deliberate relationship with the environment. And within this more deliberate approach, the idea of cleanliness begins to shift once again. It remains relative, still bounded by the realities of the time, but it becomes more closely tied to ideas of order, of governance, of what it means for a place to function well. A well-managed environment is not necessarily a clean one by modern standards, but it is one where certain problems are addressed, where certain expectations are met. This governance was not absolute, could not be, but it introduced a new layer of structure, one that would continue to evolve slowly as medieval societies faced the ongoing challenge of living in environments that were never entirely clean, yet increasingly seen as something that could, perhaps, be shaped with greater intention over time. And once the idea of intention begins to take hold, even in small ways, it changes how people relate to what once felt unavoidable. Dirt, which had long been accepted as a constant condition, starts to become something more noticeable when it is temporarily reduced. A cleared street, even for a short period, makes its return to disorder feel more immediate. A space that has been aired, washed, or reorganized creates a brief contrast, one that lingers in memory even after the old conditions quietly return. This contrast is subtle but powerful. It introduces the possibility of comparison, and with comparison comes a quiet form of expectation. Not a demand for perfection, but a growing awareness that things might be different, at least for a time. And this awareness begins to shift behavior in ways that are not always obvious. People start to anticipate certain conditions. They expect that a market space might be kept relatively clear before a busy day, that a street near a central building might receive attention more regularly than others, that certain forms of waste should be moved, if not immediately, then within a reasonable period. These expectations do not eliminate the old realities, but they layer something new on top of them, a sense that disorder is no longer entirely neutral, but something that can be measured against moments of order. And within this shifting perspective, responsibility begins to change as well. Where once the burden of managing dirt fell almost entirely on individuals and households, there is now a gradual movement toward shared responsibility, not evenly distributed and not always enforced, but increasingly present. Certain roles begin to emerge, individuals tasked formally or informally with maintaining particular areas, not in a continuous or systematic way, but in response to need. Clearing debris after a period of heavy use, managing specific spaces where accumulation becomes especially noticeable. These roles are often limited and sometimes temporary, but they represent an important development, the idea that maintaining the environment is not solely a private matter, but something that can be organized at a broader level. At the same time, enforcement begins to take on a slightly more defined shape. Rules that had once existed more as suggestions or traditions are, in some places, written down and attached to consequences. Not always severe and not always consistently applied, but present. A fine for disposing of waste in the wrong place. A warning for neglecting a shared responsibility. These measures are not universal, and they are not always effective, but they signal a shift. They suggest that the condition of the environment is becoming something that can be regulated, even if only imperfectly. And yet, even as these structures develop, they coexist with the same limitations that have always been there. A rule cannot create resources where none exist. It cannot eliminate the need for labor or reduce the effort required to maintain a space. It can encourage behavior, but it cannot guarantee it. So the results remain uneven. Some areas improve, at least temporarily. Others remain largely unchanged. The difference between them becomes more visible, more noticeable, as expectations evolve. And this visibility has its own effect. It draws attention to inequality in new ways, not just in terms of wealth or status, but in terms of environment. The condition of a street, a neighborhood, a market space, these begin to reflect not only the resources available, but the level of organization, the presence of shared effort, the degree to which new expectations have taken hold. This does not create a clear division between clean and dirty spaces, but it introduces variation, contrast, a sense that some places are more managed than others, and people respond to this variation. They choose where to spend time, where to conduct business, where to live if they have the means to do so. These choices are not always conscious, and they are not always available to everyone. But over time, they influence patterns of movement and settlement. And as these patterns shift, they begin to reinforce the changes that are already underway. Areas that are maintained more consistently attract more activity, which in turn justifies further attention. Areas that are neglected may fall further behind, their conditions becoming more difficult to change. This process is gradual and often subtle, but it shapes the evolution of towns in ways that are closely tied to the management of dirt and the expectations surrounding it. At the same time, there is another development unfolding, one that operates on a slightly different level. As written records become more common, the idea of continuity begins to extend beyond individual memory. Practices that were once passed along through observation and habit can now, in some cases, be preserved in written form. This does not mean they are always followed, but it means they can be referred to, repeated, reinforced across time in a more stable way. And this stability allows for a different kind of thinking. Instead of reacting to conditions as they arise, there is the possibility, however limited, of planning, of anticipating problems, of establishing routines that aim to prevent them, rather than simply responding after the fact. This is not planning in the modern sense. It is constrained, shaped by uncertainty and limited knowledge. But it represents a step toward a more deliberate relationship with the environment. And within this more deliberate approach, the idea of cleanliness begins to shift once again. It remains relative, still bounded by the realities of the time. But it becomes more closely tied to ideas of order, of governance, of what it means for a place to function well. A well-managed environment is not necessarily a clean one by modern standards, but it is one where certain problems are addressed, where certain expectations are met, because managing one form of dirt did not necessarily address another. Clearing mud from a street did not remove the dust that would settle later. Moving waste to a designated area did not eliminate the odors carried by the air. Washing a garment did not prevent it from quickly absorbing the surrounding environment again. This multiplicity required a more nuanced approach. Not a single solution, but a series of small, overlapping efforts, each addressing a part of the problem, none resolving it entirely. And it is here that the idea of routine begins to take on greater importance. Not just daily habits, but shared patterns, times when certain tasks were carried out, moments when attention was focused on particular aspects of the environment. These routines were not always formalized, but they created a kind of rhythm at the level of the community. A day when a street might be cleared, a time when waste was expected to be moved, a period when certain activities were paused or shifted. These rhythms did not eliminate disorder, but they provided intervals of relative order, moments when conditions improved, however briefly. And those moments, repeated over time, began to shape expectations more firmly. They created a sense that the environment could, at least occasionally, be brought into a more manageable state. And with that sense came a deeper question, not always spoken, but increasingly present. If it can be done sometimes, why not more often? This question did not have an easy answer. It touched on the limits of labor, of resources, of coordination. It revealed the gap between possibility and practicality. But it also pushed thinking forward. It encouraged people to consider not just what was, but what might be done differently. And as this consideration spread, it began to intersect with broader changes, shifts in how communities organized themselves, how authority was exercised, how responsibilities were defined. These shifts were gradual, uneven, often incomplete, but they carried the relationship between people and their environment into new territory. A territory where dirt was no longer simply endured, nor even just managed in isolated ways, but increasingly understood as part of a system that could be influenced, shaped, and, in certain moments, brought into a form that felt, if only briefly, more controlled than before. And once something begins to feel even slightly controllable, it changes not just behavior but attention. People begin to notice details they might once have overlooked. The way water collects in certain corners of a street after rain. The way refuse gathers more heavily near a particular doorway. The way air seems to linger in some places and move more freely in others. These observations are small, but they accumulate. Over time, they create a more detailed mental map of the environment, not just where things are, but how they behave, where dirt settles, where it spreads, where it can be more easily removed, and where it resists effort. And this growing awareness introduces a new kind of subtle skill. Not the ability to eliminate dirt, but the ability to anticipate it. A person might step slightly to one side of a street, not consciously thinking about it, but guided by experience. They might place objects in a particular part of a room, knowing that it remains drier or less exposed. They might time certain tasks, washing, cleaning, airing, based on patterns they have come to recognize. These are quiet adjustments, often invisible to others, but they represent a deeper engagement with the environment, an understanding that goes beyond simple reaction and moves towards something closer to management. And as more people develop this awareness, it begins to influence shared spaces in more coordinated ways. Certain paths become more consistently used, not just because they are shorter, but because they are more reliable under changing conditions. Certain areas are avoided during particular times of year or after certain kinds of weather. This collective behavior gradually reinforces itself. The more a path is used, the more it is maintained, even if only through repeated passage. The more an area is avoided, the less effort is spent on it, allowing conditions there to worsen further. In this way, the landscape of a town becomes not just a physical space, but a reflection of accumulated decisions, each one shaped by the presence of dirt and the effort to navigate it. At the same time, another layer of adaptation begins to take shape within the home. If the outside environment cannot be fully controlled, then the interior space becomes an area where effort can be concentrated, however modestly. This does not mean that homes become clean in a modern sense, but it does mean that more attention is given to how space is organized. Separation becomes a quiet priority. Not complete separation, but enough to create distinctions. Areas for sleeping, for eating, for working, each with its own degree of care, its own expectations. This organization helps manage the spread of dirt within the home. It limits, as much as possible, the movement of the most disruptive elements. It creates zones where a person can feel, at least temporarily, more removed from the constant flow of the outside world. And within these zones, certain practices become more consistent. Clothing might be set aside more deliberately. Tools might be cleaned, at least in a basic sense, before being stored. Surfaces might be cleared at the end of the day, not to eliminate all traces of use, but to restore a sense of order. These actions are not dramatic. They do not transform the environment completely, but they create a rhythm, a pattern of effort and restoration that gives structure to daily life. And within that structure, there is a kind of psychological effect. A space that has been arranged, even imperfectly, feels different from one that has been left entirely to accumulation. It offers a sense of control, of intention, even when the underlying conditions remain the same. This sense of control matters. It provides a counterbalance to the unpredictability of the wider environment. It allows individuals to feel that, within certain limits, they can shape their surroundings. And as this feeling becomes more common, it begins to influence expectations beyond the home. People start to carry these ideas into shared spaces. If a household can maintain a certain level of order, however modest, then perhaps a street can as well. If a room can be arranged to limit the spread of dirt, perhaps a market space can be organized in a way that makes it more manageable. These are not immediate transformations. They are gradual extensions of existing practices. But they represent a shift in thinking from accepting conditions as fixed to considering how they might be adjusted. And this shift is reinforced by the increasing interaction between different communities. As people travel, they encounter places where these adjustments have been made in slightly different ways. A town where certain streets are more consistently cleared. A marketplace arranged with more deliberate spacing. A water source managed with greater care. These differences are not always large, but they are noticeable. And they invite comparison, not in a formal or analytical sense, but in the quiet recognition that things can be done differently. This recognition spreads slowly, carried by individuals as they move between places, shared through observation and conversation. And over time, it contributes to a broader sense that the environment is not entirely fixed, that it can be shaped, improved, or at least guided in certain directions. But as this sense grows, so too does the awareness of its limits. Because every attempt to improve conditions reveals the effort required to sustain those improvements. A street cleared once must be cleared again. A system for managing waste must be maintained. A space arranged with care must be kept that way through repeated attention. And this repetition requires coordination. It requires people to act not just individually, but collectively, to align their efforts, to follow shared expectations, to contribute to a system that benefits the whole. This is not always easy. Differences in resources, in priorities, in willingness to participate all influence how well such coordination can be achieved. Some communities manage it more effectively than others. Some periods see greater cooperation, while others fall back into more individual patterns. But the idea itself that shared effort can shape the environment continues to gain ground. And as it does, it begins to intersect with another important development: the gradual emergence of more defined authority within towns, structures that can, at least in principle, organize, direct, and enforce collective action. This authority is not absolute. It operates within limits, constrained by resources, by local conditions, by the need for cooperation. But it introduces a new element into the relationship between people and their environment. Because now, the management of dirt is no longer only a matter of habit or even shared expectation. It becomes increasingly a matter of policy, of decisions made at a level beyond the individual, applied however imperfectly to the community as a whole. And within this emerging framework, the question is no longer simply how people live with dirt, but how they attempt together to shape the conditions that define it. And once that question enters the life of a town, even in a limited way, it begins to alter the relationship between individuals and the spaces they share. Because shaping the environment collectively requires something more than awareness. It requires agreement. Not necessarily full consensus, but a workable alignment between people who may have very different priorities, resources, and daily concerns. This is where tension quietly emerges. A rule about waste, for example, might seem reasonable in principle, but following it could require time, effort, or access to a designated space that is not equally convenient for everyone. What benefits the shared environment might feel, in the moment, like an additional burden on the individual. And so compliance is uneven. Some follow the rule more closely, either out of agreement, habit, or concern for how they are perceived. Others follow it when it is convenient, and not when it is not. Still others ignore it entirely, whether out of necessity or indifference. This unevenness does not stop the system from existing, but it shapes how effective it can be. And it introduces a new layer to the experience of dirt, not just as a physical condition, but as something connected to behavior, to responsibility, to the subtle dynamics between individuals and their community. A street left uncleared is no longer simply the result of circumstance. It may also reflect a lapse in cooperation, a gap between expectation and action. This changes how such spaces are perceived. They are not only inconvenient, they become, in a quiet way, a reflection of social order or the lack of it. And within that reflection, people begin to notice more than just the physical environment. They notice patterns of behavior: who contributes to maintaining a space, who does not, who takes visible steps to manage their surroundings, and who leaves those efforts to others. These observations are rarely spoken aloud, but they influence how people think about one another. Cleanliness, even in its limited medieval form, becomes tied more closely to ideas of reliability, discipline, and belonging. Not perfectly, and not without exceptions, but enough to matter, and this connection adds weight to the efforts already underway. Maintaining a space is no longer only about comfort or practicality. It becomes, in part, about participation in a shared system, a way of aligning oneself with the emerging expectations of the community. At the same time, those who hold positions of authority begin to face a different kind of challenge. If rules are to be more than symbolic, they must be enforced. But enforcement requires resources, time, labor, attention that are themselves limited. This leads to selective focus. Certain areas receive more attention than others. Certain rules are emphasized, while others are allowed to fade into the background. Enforcement becomes, in effect, another layer of prioritization, decisions about where effort will have the greatest impact, or where disorder is most visible. These decisions are not always consistent. They can shift with changing conditions, with leadership, with the pressures facing a town at any given moment. But they reinforce an important idea, that the environment is something that can be influenced through structured action, even if that influence is partial and uneven. And as this idea becomes more established, it begins to interact with another aspect of medieval life: reputation. Towns, especially those connected to trade or travel, are not isolated. They are part of a wider network, observed and experienced by those who move between places. The condition of a town, its streets, its markets, its general atmosphere, becomes part of how it is perceived. Not in a formal sense, but through the impressions carried by travelers, merchants, and visitors. A place that feels more orderly, more manageable, may be remembered differently from one that feels more chaotic, more difficult to navigate. These impressions, in turn, can influence behavior, where traders choose to stop, where goods are exchanged, where people feel more comfortable spending time. And so the management of dirt, modest as it may be, begins to intersect with economic considerations. Maintaining certain standards, even intermittently, can have practical benefits beyond immediate comfort. This adds another layer of motivation, not just personal, not just communal, but connected to the broader position of a town within its region. And yet, even with these motivations, the underlying reality does not disappear. Dirt remains constant. Effort remains limited. Systems, however well-intended, remain imperfect. This creates a kind of dual experience. On one level, there is the ongoing presence of dirt, the familiar, persistent condition that shapes daily life. On another, there is the emerging effort to manage it, the routines, the rules, the shared expectations that aim to bring a degree of order to that condition. These two layers do not replace each other. They coexist. Sometimes they align, producing moments where the environment feels more controlled, more stable. At other times, they diverge, revealing the limits of what can be achieved. And within this coexistence, people continue to adapt. They navigate not only the physical environment, but the social expectations that now accompany it. They adjust their behavior in response to both, balancing personal needs with shared norms, immediate concerns with longer-term patterns. This balancing act becomes part of the texture of life. Not dramatic, not always visible, but present in small decisions, repeated over time. And as these decisions accumulate, they gradually reshape the relationship between individuals and their surroundings. Because the environment is no longer experienced solely as something external. It becomes, increasingly, something that reflects collective action. Something that carries the imprint of human decisions, however constrained those decisions may be. And this realization, once it takes hold, opens the door to further change. Not sudden transformation, but a slow expansion of what people believe is possible. A widening of the gap between what is accepted and what might be improved. And it is within that widening gap that medieval communities will continue to experiment, quietly, unevenly, with new ways of organizing space, managing resources, and redefining the boundaries between the world they inhabit and the conditions they are willing to live within. That quiet shift from accepting conditions to questioning them does not happen all at once. It unfolds gradually, often in response to moments when the balance tips too far. A particularly wet season, for example, might turn already difficult streets into something nearly impassable. Water collects where it should not, mixing with everything it encounters, slowing movement, disrupting trade, making even short journeys more demanding than usual. In those moments, the limits of existing habits become more visible. What once felt manageable begins to feel excessive. The effort required to navigate daily life increases, and with it, the awareness that something, however small, might need to change. And so, responses emerge, not always coordinated at first and not always sustained, but present. More attention is given to drainage, even if it means digging shallow channels or clearing obstructions that had been allowed to remain. Temporary walkways might be created, simple additions that provide slightly more stable footing in the most heavily used areas. These efforts do not transform the environment entirely, but they reduce the immediate strain, and in doing so, they reinforce the idea that even limited intervention can make a difference. The same pattern appears during periods of unusual heat. As temperatures rise, the effects of accumulated waste become more noticeable. Smells intensify, the air feels heavier, less forgiving. What might have been tolerated in cooler conditions becomes harder to ignore. Again, the response is not uniform, but it is present. Efforts are made to move waste more quickly, to clear certain areas before conditions worsen further. Windows are opened more frequently, despite the trade-offs with dust or noise. Spaces are adjusted in small ways to encourage airflow. These actions are practical, immediate, and often temporary, but they reflect a deeper change in awareness, a growing sensitivity to the environment, not just as a constant, but as something that fluctuates, that responds to conditions that can become more or less manageable depending on how it is treated. And this sensitivity feeds back into the systems that are slowly developing, because each moment of difficulty, each temporary solution, adds to a shared understanding of what works and what does not. Over time, this understanding begins to influence more deliberate decisions. Instead of waiting for conditions to worsen, there is a gradual movement, uneven but noticeable, toward anticipation. Clearing a space before it becomes unusable, adjusting routines based on expected changes in weather, paying attention not just to what is happening, but to what is likely to happen next. This forward-looking approach is limited by uncertainty, of course. Predictions are not always accurate. Conditions can change in unexpected ways. But the intention itself marks a shift. It suggests that people are beginning to think of their environment not only in terms of immediate experience, but in terms of patterns, of cycles, of cause and effect. And within this framework, dirt becomes something that can be partially predicted. Not eliminated, not fully controlled, but understood in its movement, how it gathers, how it spreads, how it responds to human activity and natural conditions alike. This understanding, in turn, shapes behavior in more subtle ways. People begin to time their actions more carefully, to choose when to wash, when to clean, when to move through certain areas. They develop a sense of rhythm that aligns with the environment, rather than working entirely against it. And as more individuals adopt these rhythms, they begin to overlap, creating, at times, a kind of collective timing. Moments when many people are engaged in similar efforts, clearing, washing, adjusting, whether by coincidence or shared expectation. These moments do not last. They are not coordinated in a formal sense, but they contribute to periods where conditions improve, even if only briefly. And those periods, once experienced, are not easily forgotten. They linger in memory, shaping expectations, influencing future behavior. This is how change begins to take root, not through a single decision, but through repeated experiences that gradually alter how people think about what is possible. And yet, even as this process unfolds, it remains grounded in the same fundamental constraints. Time is still limited. Labor is still required. Resources are still unevenly distributed. Not everyone can participate in these efforts to the same degree. For some, daily survival leaves little room for additional tasks. The priority remains immediate food, shelter, work. Managing the environment beyond what is strictly necessary becomes a secondary concern, if it is a concern at all. For others, there is slightly more flexibility. More time to observe, to adjust, to participate in emerging practices. More capacity to align with evolving expectations. This difference does not create a clear divide, but it introduces variation. Variation in how people experience their environment. Variation in how they respond to it. Variation in how closely they can engage with the idea of shaping it. And within this variation, the relationship between individuals and their surroundings becomes more complex, because it is no longer defined solely by necessity. It is also influenced by choice, limited, constrained, but present. A decision to clear a space even when it might be left alone. A decision to follow a rule even when enforcement is uncertain. A decision to align with emerging norms even when they are not universally observed. These choices, small as they may seem, accumulate. They contribute to a gradual redefinition of what is expected, what is acceptable, what is worth the effort. And as expectations shift, they begin to influence not just behavior, but perception. What once felt normal may begin to feel slightly out of place. What once went unnoticed may draw attention. What once seemed unavoidable may begin to feel, if not entirely changeable, then at least open to question. This questioning does not lead to immediate answers, but it keeps the process moving. It sustains the tension between acceptance and improvement, between what is and what might be. And it is within that tension that medieval communities continue to evolve, adjusting, experimenting, learning through repetition and experience. Not moving toward a world without dirt, which remains far beyond reach, but toward a world where the presence of dirt is understood, managed, and, in certain moments, shaped by human intention in ways that would have seemed less imaginable in earlier times. And as that intention becomes more visible, it begins to change something even quieter, the emotional texture of daily life. Because living in constant contact with dirt is not only a physical experience. It is also a psychological one, shaped by what a person notices, what they ignore, and what they come to expect. When dirt is simply accepted as an unchanging background, it fades into a kind of neutrality. It is there, but it does not demand constant attention. It becomes part of the environment in the same way that weather or terrain might be, something to work with rather than something to question. But once improvement becomes imaginable, even in small ways, that neutrality begins to shift. Dirt becomes more visible, not because there is more of it, but because there are now moments when there is less. And those moments create contrast. A freshly cleared space, even if it lasts only a short time, lingers in the mind. It becomes a reference point, a quiet reminder that the environment can feel different, even if only briefly. And when that difference fades, it is noticed. This noticing does not always lead to frustration. Often, it is more subtle than that, a kind of quiet awareness that something has changed, and then changed back again. But over time, it influences how people feel within their surroundings. A space that has been managed feels, in those moments, more stable, more predictable. It offers a sense, however temporary, of ease. And that sense of ease begins to matter. It becomes something people seek, when they can. Something they recreate in small ways within their own spaces, or look for in the places they choose to spend time. This is not a dramatic shift. It does not transform the conditions of life overnight, but it introduces a new layer of experience. Living with dirt is no longer only about endurance or adaptation. It becomes, in part, about negotiation, about finding ways to create moments of relief within a broader condition that remains largely unchanged. And this negotiation begins to shape habits in more refined ways. People become more attentive to transitions. The movement from outside to inside, for instance, takes on slightly more significance. The threshold of a doorway is no longer just a physical boundary, but a point of adjustment. Shoes are checked, even if only briefly. Hands may be wiped. Outer garments might be set aside more deliberately. These actions are small, almost automatic, but they represent an effort to manage what is carried from one space into another. And as these efforts become more consistent, they begin to influence the design of spaces themselves. Entryways are used differently. Objects are placed with greater intention near points of transition. Areas are subtly arranged to contain the movement of dirt, even if only in limited ways. Inside the home, similar refinements appear, not in the form of complete separation, which remains impractical, but in the form of clearer distinctions. A place for eating that is kept slightly more orderly. A sleeping area that is given a bit more attention. A corner where tools are stored in a way that limits their impact on the rest of the space. These distinctions do not eliminate the presence of dirt, but they create variation, and that variation allows people to experience their environment in different ways at different moments. A place to rest that feels, if not entirely clean, then at least more contained. A space to work where mess is expected and accepted. A surface that is cleared not because it must be, but because it makes the next activity easier. These adjustments are not dramatic, but they accumulate. They create a more structured relationship with the environment, one in which dirt is still present, but more consciously managed. And as this structure develops within individual homes, it begins to reflect outward into shared life. Public expectations, already forming, become slightly more defined. There is a growing sense that certain behaviors are not just practical but appropriate. That managing one's immediate surroundings is part of participating in a community. This does not eliminate inconsistency. Not everyone follows these expectations equally. Not every situation allows for them to be observed. But they exist and they influence how people think about themselves and others. A person who makes visible efforts to maintain order is seen differently from one who does not. A household that appears more managed stands out, even if the difference is modest. These perceptions are not always fair, and they are not always accurate. But they shape social interaction in subtle ways. And as they do, they reinforce the importance of effort. Not perfection, which remains out of reach, but effort, visible, repeated, aligned with emerging norms. This emphasis on effort connects directly to another quiet shift. The idea that the condition of the environment reflects not only circumstances, but choices. Choices made by individuals, by households, by communities. This does not mean that people suddenly believe they have full control. The limitations remain clear, but it introduces a sense of partial responsibility. A recognition that while the environment cannot be entirely changed, it can be influenced, and that influence depends at least in part on human action. And once that recognition takes hold, it begins to affect how people respond to moments of breakdown. When a space becomes excessively difficult to manage, when conditions deteriorate beyond what feels acceptable, the response is no longer only resignation. There is increasingly a search for cause. What led to this? Was it neglect, a failure of routine, an external condition that could have been anticipated? These questions are not always answered clearly, but they represent a shift in thinking from accepting conditions as given to examining how they come to be. And this examination feeds back into the ongoing process of adaptation. It informs future decisions, shapes emerging practices, influences how communities respond to similar situations when they arise again. In this way, the relationship between people and dirt becomes more dynamic. Less static, less purely reactive, more engaged. Still constrained, still imperfect, but evolving. And as this evolution continues, it begins to intersect with something even broader. Not just the management of daily life, but the way medieval societies understand order itself, how it is created, how it is maintained, and how it can be disrupted. Because in a world where dirt is constant, the effort to manage it becomes a visible expression of something deeper, an attempt to impose structure on an environment that is always quietly moving in the opposite direction. And that tension between structure and slow, inevitable disorder becomes one of the defining features of medieval daily life, even if it is rarely named as such. Because no matter how carefully a space is arranged, how deliberately a routine is followed, or how consistently a rule is applied, the environment continues to press back. Dust settles again. Mud returns with the next rain. Smoke leaves its trace no matter how well a fire is managed. This is not failure. It is simply the condition of the world as it was experienced. And yet, within that condition, the act of maintaining order takes on a kind of quiet meaning. It becomes less about achieving a final state and more about sustaining a process that must be repeated, adjusted, and carried forward day after day. This repetition shapes not only the environment, but the mindset of those who live within it. It encourages a form of attentiveness that is both practical and subtle. A constant, low-level awareness of surroundings. A readiness to respond, to adjust, to restore. And over time, this attentiveness becomes habitual. A person does not consciously think about every small action. Wiping a surface, shaking out a garment, stepping around a patch of ground. But these actions accumulate, forming a pattern of engagement with the environment. This pattern is neither rigid nor entirely free. It exists within the constraints of daily life, shaped by necessity, by available time, by competing demands. But it also reflects a growing sense of agency, the understanding that small actions, repeated over time, can, and as this understanding spreads, it begins to connect individual habits to larger systems in more visible ways. A street that is kept relatively clear is not the result of a single effort, but of many small actions aligning. A market that remains functional through a busy period does so because multiple people, in different roles, contribute to its maintenance. This alignment is not always planned. It often emerges through repetition, through shared expectation, through the quiet recognition of what needs to be done. But once it appears, it can be reinforced. Through example, through social pressure, through the gradual formalization of practices that were once informal. And in this reinforcement, something important begins to take shape. The idea that order is not only possible, but something that can be collectively sustained, at least for a time. This idea does not eliminate the underlying reality of dirt, but it reframes it. Dirt is no longer only an external force to be endured. It becomes part of a cycle, one that includes both accumulation and removal, both disorder and restoration. And within that cycle, human action gains a clearer role, not as a means of complete control, but as a way of influencing the balance. This balance, however, is always delicate, because the same factors that allow for moments of order, coordination, effort, shared expectation, are also vulnerable to disruption. A change in population, a shift in economic activity, a period of instability or conflict. Any of these can strain the systems that have been built, revealing how dependent they are on continuity. When continuity is interrupted, even briefly, the environment responds quickly. Accumulation accelerates. Maintenance falls behind. Spaces that were once managed begin to slip back into more familiar patterns. And in those moments, the contrast becomes clear. The difference between a space that is maintained and one that is not is no longer abstract. It is experienced directly. This experience can have a lasting effect. It can reinforce the value of the systems that were in place. It can highlight the effort required to sustain them, and it can shape how people respond when stability returns. Because once a community has experienced both sides of that balance, order and its absence, it carries that memory forward. It informs future decisions. It influences how quickly people act when conditions begin to deteriorate again. It strengthens, in some cases, the willingness to participate in shared efforts. But this response is not uniform. Just as before, variation remains. Some individuals, some households, some areas of a town engage more actively with these systems. Others remain on the edges, participating when necessary, but not fully aligned. This variation is part of the reality of medieval life. It reflects differences in resources, in priorities, in the ability to contribute to collective efforts. And it ensures that the environment never becomes entirely consistent. Even within a single town, conditions can vary from one street to another, from one space to the next. This variability adds another layer to the experience of dirt. It means that the environment is not only changing over time, but also across space. That a person moving through a town encounters a series of different conditions, some more managed, some less so. And navigating these differences becomes part of daily life. People learn where to go, where to avoid, where to expect certain conditions. They adjust their behavior accordingly, often without conscious thought. This navigation is both practical and perceptual. It shapes not only how people move, but how they think about the spaces around them. Certain areas come to be associated with order, with effort, with a degree of control. Others are seen as more chaotic, more difficult, more subject to the constant pull of accumulation. These associations are not fixed, and they can change over time. But they influence how a town is experienced, both by those who live within it and by those who pass through. And as these perceptions develop, they begin to interact with the broader structures of medieval society. Authority, reputation, economic activity, all of these are affected in subtle ways by the condition of the environment. A space that feels more controlled may support certain kinds of activity more easily. A space that feels less predictable may discourage them. These effects are not always direct, and they are rarely the result of a single cause. But they are part of the complex web of factors that shape how communities function. And within that web, the management of dirt, so ordinary, so constant, plays a role that is both practical and symbolic. It reflects the limits of human control, but also the persistence of human effort. It reveals the challenges of living in a world where conditions cannot be fully mastered, but can be influenced, at least in part. And as medieval communities continue to evolve, this balance between what can be controlled and what cannot remains at the center of their relationship with the environment. A relationship that is still shifting, still adapting, still searching for ways to bring a measure of order to a world that is always, quietly, moving toward disorder, even as people continue, day by day, to push gently in the other direction. And that gentle push, repeated across thousands of small actions, begins to leave traces, not just in the condition of spaces, but in the expectations that quietly shape them. Because once people become accustomed to intervening, even in limited ways, the absence of that intervention starts to feel different. Not necessarily shocking, but noticeable in a way it might not have been before. A space left unattended no longer blends as easily into the background. It stands out slightly, not because it is new, but because the context around it has changed. This shift in perception is subtle, but it carries consequences. It encourages earlier responses. A patch of ground that begins to deteriorate may be addressed sooner than it once would have been. A buildup of debris may prompt action before it reaches a more disruptive level. These responses are not always immediate, and they are not always consistent. but they reflect a growing sensitivity to change. A sense that conditions are not fixed but moving, and that movement can be influenced at least at certain points along the way. And as this sensitivity develops, it begins to interact with memory in more complex ways. People remember how a space looked when it was more manageable. They recall the conditions after a recent clearing, after a period of attention, after a moment when effort aligned effectively. These memories are not always precise, but they shape expectations. They create a kind of internal reference, a sense of what is possible, even if that possibility is temporary. And when current conditions fall short of that reference, the difference is felt. Not always as dissatisfaction, but as awareness. A recognition that the environment has shifted, and that it might, under the right circumstances, be shifted again. This awareness feeds into behavior, often without being fully articulated. It influences how quickly people respond to emerging problems, how willing they are to participate in shared efforts, how they judge the state of their surroundings. And over time, it contributes to a gradual tightening of standards. Not formal standards necessarily, but informal ones, shared understandings of what is acceptable, what is expected, what is worth addressing. These understandings vary from place to place, from community to community, but they become part of the social fabric. They shape interactions, influence decisions, and guide the small, repeated actions that collectively affect the environment. At the same time, the physical reality continues to assert itself. No matter how refined these expectations become, they remain bounded by the same constraints: time, labor, resources, knowledge. There are always moments when effort falls short, when conditions overwhelm the systems in place, when the balance between order and accumulation tips, sometimes quickly, sometimes gradually. And in those moments, the limits of control become visible again. This visibility does not erase the progress that has been made, but it reminds people of its fragility, that what has been achieved can be undone, that maintaining order requires continuity, not just intention. And this realization introduces a kind of caution, a recognition that improvement is not a one-time achievement, but an ongoing process, one that must be sustained, adapted, and reinforced over time. This caution, in turn, influences how people approach change. They become more attentive to what can be maintained, not just what can be created. More aware of the effort required to sustain even modest improvements. And this awareness shapes the pace of development. Changes are often incremental, tested through experience, adjusted based on results. What proves manageable is retained. What proves too demanding may be abandoned or modified. This process is slow, but it is steady. And as it continues, it begins to influence not just how people act, but how they think about the relationship between effort and outcome. Because in a world where complete control is not possible, success is measured differently. Not by the absence of dirt, but by the degree to which it can be kept within certain bounds. Not by permanence, but by persistence. A space that remains manageable over time, even with fluctuations, represents a kind of success. A system that can be maintained, even imperfectly, holds value. And this redefinition of success has broader implications. It allows people to engage with their environment in a way that is neither purely passive nor unrealistically ambitious. It creates a middle ground, one in which effort is meaningful even when outcomes are partial. And within that middle ground, a more stable relationship begins to form. One in which people understand both the possibilities and the limits of their influence. One in which they can act with intention, without expecting complete transformation. This relationship is not static. It continues to evolve as conditions change, as communities grow, as new challenges emerge. But it provides a foundation, a way of thinking about the environment that supports ongoing adaptation. And as this foundation strengthens, it begins to support more complex forms of organization. Efforts that go beyond immediate response toward more structured approaches to managing space. Systems that aim not just to address problems as they arise, but to reduce their frequency, to shape conditions in advance. These systems are still limited, still uneven, still subject to the same constraints. But they represent a continuation of the same process, the gradual extension of human intention into the environment. And as that extension continues, it brings with it new questions. Not just about how to manage dirt, but about how far such management can go. What level of control is possible and at what cost? How effort should be distributed and who should bear it? These questions do not have simple answers. They are negotiated, in practice, through the same patterns that have shaped everything so far, through experience, through adaptation, through the quiet accumulation of knowledge. And as they are negotiated, they continue to shape the world in which medieval people live. A world where dirt remains constant, but its meaning, its management, and its place within daily life are no longer quite the same as they once were, and are still, even now, in the process of becoming something new. And it is within that ongoing process that a quieter transformation begins to take shape, one that is less visible in any single moment, but increasingly present across time. Because as practices repeat, as expectations settle, and as small systems hold together long enough to be remembered, they begin to form something more stable than habit alone. They begin to form continuity, not perfect continuity, not unbroken, but enough to create a sense that certain things can be relied upon, that a space will be tended to again, even if not immediately, that a routine will return even if it has lapsed, that effort, once established, has a way of resurfacing. This sense of continuity changes how people approach their environment. It allows them to act with a slightly longer perspective, not only responding to what is in front of them, but anticipating what will come next, trusting that certain patterns will repeat. And within that trust, new forms of coordination become possible. Tasks that once depended entirely on individual initiative begin, in some places, to align more consistently. Not through strict scheduling, but through shared rhythm. A particular time of day when certain areas are more likely to be attended to. A recurring moment when attention shifts toward clearing, organizing, restoring. These rhythms are not always deliberate. They emerge from repeated action, from the natural flow of daily life. But once they exist, they create opportunities for greater efficiency, for efforts to overlap rather than scatter. And when efforts overlap, even briefly, their effects become more noticeable. A street cleared by several people in close succession remains manageable longer than one tended sporadically. A shared space that receives attention from multiple directions holds its condition more effectively, even if only for a short time. These moments of alignment do not last indefinitely, but they demonstrate something important. That coordination, even without formal structure, can amplify the impact of individual actions. And this realization begins to influence how people think about their role within the environment. Not only as individuals managing their own immediate surroundings, but as participants in a broader pattern, one in which their actions contribute to a collective outcome. This shift is subtle, and it does not occur everywhere in the same way. But where it does take hold, it adds a new dimension to daily life. Effort becomes not only practical, but relational, a way of connecting to others through shared action, even when that connection is not explicitly acknowledged. And within this relational framework, the experience of dirt changes once again. It remains present, constant, unavoidable, but it is now encountered within a system of responses, some individual, some shared, some emerging, some fading. This system is not stable. It expands and contracts, strengthens and weakens, depending on conditions. But it exists, and its existence creates a different kind of environment. not one defined solely by the presence of dirt, but by the interaction between dirt and effort, between accumulation and response, between what settles and what is lifted away. And as this interaction becomes more central to daily life, it begins to influence other aspects of behavior. Time, for example, takes on a slightly different character. Moments are no longer defined only by work, rest, or social activity, but also by opportunities to act before conditions worsen, to restore a space while it is still manageable, to align with others when effort is most effective. These opportunities are not always taken, but they are recognized, and that recognition shapes how time is used, even if only in small ways. Similarly, attention becomes more selective. Not every detail can be managed. Not every space can be maintained equally. So choices are made, sometimes consciously, often instinctively, about where effort will be directed, which areas matter most, which conditions are most disruptive, which tasks offer the greatest return for the effort invested. These choices reflect a growing sophistication in how people engage with their environment, an understanding that management is not about doing everything, but about doing enough in the right places at the right times. And this understanding, once established, allows for more deliberate forms of organization to emerge. Not all at once and not uniformly, but gradually. Structures that build on existing habits. Systems that extend shared rhythms into more consistent practices. Expectations that begin to carry more weight, not just socially but functionally. These developments are still constrained by the same limits, resources, labor, knowledge, but they operate with greater clarity. They reflect an environment that is no longer entirely reactive, but increasingly shaped by intention, however partial that intention may be. And yet, even as intention grows stronger, the underlying reality remains. Dirt does not disappear. It continues to settle, to gather, to move in ways that are not fully predictable or controllable. The balance between order and disorder is never resolved, but it is engaged with more actively. And that engagement, persistent, imperfect, evolving, becomes one of the defining features of medieval life. A constant negotiation between what can be done and what cannot, between the desire for stability and the inevitability of change. And as this negotiation continues, it begins to extend beyond the immediate environment, because the same patterns of observation, adaptation, coordination start to appear in other areas of life as well, in how resources are managed, in how communities organize themselves, in how knowledge is shared and preserved. The experience of living with dirt, in other words, is not isolated. It becomes part of a broader way of thinking, a way of approaching problems, of responding to limitations, of working within constraints rather than attempting to eliminate them entirely. And as this way of thinking spreads, it carries with it the potential for further change. Not sudden transformation, but gradual evolution. A slow, steady movement toward systems that are more deliberate, more coordinated, more capable of shaping the conditions in which people live. And it is within that movement that medieval communities continue to adjust, quietly, persistently, refining their relationship with an environment that remains at its core, resistant to complete control, even as they continue to find new ways to live within it. And it is within that movement that medieval communities continue to adjust, quietly, persistently, refining their relationship with an environment that remains, at its core, resistant to complete control, even as they continue to find new ways to live within it. Because if there is one thread that runs through all of this, through the mud and smoke, the crowded streets and layered homes, the small daily efforts and the larger, imperfect systems, it is not simply that people were dirty. It is that they lived in a world where cleanliness was never a fixed state, but a moving balance. A balance between effort and limitation, between what could be managed and what had to be accepted. And over time, that balance shaped more than just the physical environment. It shaped expectations, habits, and even the emotional rhythm of life itself. What felt comfortable, what felt tolerable, what felt excessive. These were not universal truths, but learned experiences, formed slowly, reinforced daily, adjusted as conditions changed. A person growing up in this world did not wake each day surprised by it. They learned it step by step. The feel of a floor underfoot, the weight of clothing at the end of a long day, the quiet difference between a space that had been tended and one that had not. And within those experiences, they developed a kind of practical intelligence. Not written down, not always explained, but understood. How to move through a street after rain. How to keep a small space manageable. How to prepare for changes in season. How to recognize when something had shifted from ordinary to concerning. This intelligence did not remove the presence of dirt, but it made life within it possible, stable enough, predictable enough to support communities that endured for generations. And perhaps this is the deeper reality that often goes unnoticed. The Middle Ages were not defined by dirt alone. They were defined by the constant, patient effort to live alongside it. An effort that was rarely dramatic, rarely complete, but always present. In the brushing of a garment, in the clearing of a path, in the opening of a window even on a cold day. Small actions repeated endlessly, forming a quiet resistance to the natural drift toward disorder. And in that resistance, there is something almost familiar. Because even now, in very different conditions, much of daily life still carries that same pattern. The need to maintain, to restore, to manage what will never stay perfectly in place. The difference is not that the medieval world was uniquely dirty. It is that the limits of control were closer, more visible, less easily hidden. And so the effort to shape the environment, to make it just a little more livable, a little more ordered, was something people felt more directly, more constantly woven into the fabric of everyday life. And as medieval societies slowly changed through growth, through new ideas, through gradual shifts in how space, labor, and responsibility were organized, that effort did not disappear. It became more structured in some places, more formalized, more supported by systems that could extend beyond individual action. But at its core, it remained the same. A quiet, persistent attempt to live within a world that could never be fully controlled, only understood, managed, and shaped, piece by piece, day after day. And perhaps the most revealing part of all this is not how different that world was, but how much of that quiet negotiation between order and disorder, between intention and limitation, still echoes in softer ways in the lives we live now. So as you think about it, I'm curious, what part of this world feels the hardest to imagine living with day after day? And if you enjoy these kinds of calm, thoughtful deep dives into history, you're always welcome to stay a little longer and explore more of it with me here.